This is Lauren Hollows from NOI Education Services, and today we are talking about, do I need an LLN? Now, I've heard a lot of conversations about this lately, and so I just wanted to raise a couple of points. First of all, I'm going to come out and say pretty much straight away that it is very, very rare circumstances when you guys do not need an LLN. And the reason for that is within a couple of the standards. So the first standard that I want to talk about today in relationship to do I need an LLN is in a language literacy and numeracy assessment for enrollment or prior to enrollment of students, is because 5.1 basically says prior to enrollment or the commencement of training and assessment, whichever comes first, the RTO provides advice to the prospective learner about the training product appropriate to meet the learner's needs, taking into account the individual's existing skills and competencies. Now, there are a couple of ways that we do this, but an LLN is definitely one of the strongest ways that you can make sure that your learners actually have the skills and the knowledge to be enrolled into the course. Now, there's a whole bunch of ways that we can do this, and they don't all have to be hugely time-consuming or frustrating for learners, because that is definitely a concern depending on the cohort that you're dealing with. Now, for those of you that are dealing with, traineeships, LLNs should be nice and simple. And the best thing that you can do is you can actually contextualize your LLN assessments to the qualifications that you are delivering. So, for example, if you're delivering a Certificate 3 in hospitality or commercial cookery, you're going to talk about calculating recipe requirements as part of your LLN. That requires students to read a recipe, calculate some of the ingredients, write out the response. That's going to give you kind of a basic idea as to whether or not the learner is going to present with any concerns for that particular qualification. Again, if you're doing it in and around automotive, you might do it in relationship to calculating the costs of a product, ordering a product, calculating rev speeds, anything along those lines. That way it becomes a more meaningful exercise and it makes a little bit more sense for the learner. And it's going to be closer to along the lines of what you're actually going to be doing when it comes to the qualification anyway. So contextualizing to your qualifications certainly makes the process a lot easier. Now, there'll be a lot of you that will look at some of the programs like LLN Robot, other commercially available products out there and kind of go, this is too much, it's just too hard, it stresses out the learners. Now, there's some valid points in there that I wanted to address. The first point is that learners can get very distressed when it comes to undertaking particular language literacy and numeracy assessments. And this is particularly the case when we've got assessments that when you're working with a cohort that might actually find that classroom scenario quite stressful. So if we're looking at particularly early 20s or teenage men, they typically have had a worse experience in the classroom, and therefore the idea of sitting down to do an assessment can cause that little bit of freeze up. Students that naturally have learning disabilities will become a little bit more anxious when they're having to participate in some of these kind of standard ones. Other ways that we can go about this are by doing things like suitability assessments, where we have discussions with the learners, where we look at samples of learners' work, things like that. However, at the end of the day, really, when you start to look at 5.1, and also when you look at your training and assessment strategy standards of like 1.1, 1.2, and finally, when we get to standard 1.7, which is all about providing requirements for the learner, it is really important for you to have an LLN. Now, one of the commercial arguments for having an LLN is also that once you've committed to a learner, any additional learner needs that kind of come up after the fact, well, you've now committed to providing training and assessment for that learner. So if, for example, you're not doing LLN assessments, when you have learners that come through that do need that additional support, if you didn't take the time to identify what that additional support was, the cost of bearing that is on you. Whereas if you're doing a proper LLN assessment beforehand and you identify that a learner is going to need some additional support, you might actually be able to either build that into the price, to build that into the program, to get learners agreement that they're going to access certain things beforehand. I know running international colleges, we've looked at things like saying, okay, well, actually prior to coming onto the Cert 3, you've got to do so many weeks of ELICOS training. It might be that within a traineeship, we actually make a decision to go from like a Cert 4 down to a Cert 3 as a more appropriate pathway for the learner as well. So that's just a little bit about that. It's a nice quick one, guys, but if you are questioning, if you don't have any kind of language literacy and numeracy assessment at the moment, I recommend that you do check out clauses 5.1, 1.7, 1.1, and 1.2, and really think about how you would justify that in a performance assessment audit scenario. What does your policies and procedures say as to how you're actually making a rational argument for how you can get away with not having a language literacy and numeracy assessment? That's it, guys. We'll continue dropping lots of videos. Keep in mind, VELG is coming up. We're going to be running some awesome specials as well. So if you are looking for training and assessment materials in relationship to SIT, SIR, BSB, HLT, or CHC, please, by all means, reach out to us because we do have a wide range of tools in our catalog now. My name is Lauren Hollows for NOI Education Services.